Man, this game is great. It's a very exciting time to be a TMNT fan, with the new movie coming out, which looks really awesome, by the way. It's also kinda gotten me back in a TMNT mood again, and since it's been a bit since I did the video on the first 2003 game, let's continue and look at the sequel to it, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2: Battle Nexus. Released about a year after the first game came out on all the same systems as the first, including a different game on the Game Boy Advance, and once again all developed and published by Konami. Unlike the first 2003 game, I didn't play this one when I was little, or Mutant Nightmare for that matter. I didn't even know either game existed until I learned what the internet was in the early 2010s. And that's when I learned that the reception towards this game in particular was not positive, to say the least. Of the trilogy, this is the one I heard the most negativity about. It got slammed back when it came out, far worse than what the first game got, and from the content creators I was watching during this time, they absolutely despised this game. It seemed like whenever someone brought it up, it was usually not in a positive light. However, recently, I have seen some more people come around towards it, and they have a little bit more fondness for this game. Heck, in the comments of the last TMNT video I did, I saw a lot of people say they really love Battle Nexus. So, it's a very divisive game. You either have people who absolutely despise it, or you have people who absolutely love it. But today, I want to see what I think about this game, as well as the GBA version. This is definitely going to be an interesting one for sure. We'll start with the console version first, and by the way, I'm playing the GameCube version like last time. Also, this box art looks really nice. It's probably my favorite cover of the three games. I really dig it. So the first game was based on the first season with a few deviations here and there. Battle Nexus is based on the tail end of season 1, and for the most part based on the big episodes from season 2. So you got stuff adapted like Turtles in Space, Secret Origins, City at War, Rogue in the House, and The Big Brawl, just to name a few. But this game has way bigger deviations from the series compared to the first game. Like, here's some examples. In Season 2, the Turtles accidentally get warped from Earth to the Federation planet. In the game, however, while they do end up there eventually, the transporter takes them to this ice planet first, which was never in the series. There's another point when the Turtles are traveling to the sewers of the Federation planet, and they actually fight the sewer rats that were just a quick cameo in Season 2. It's lots of stuff like that. But perhaps the biggest deviation from Season 2 is with a whole new character exclusive to this game named Slasher. He's basically a bounty hunter that the Turtles encounter a few times that is later revealed to be an Utrom that was heavily scarred after Shredder killed his entire family and friends. However, after the second fight with him, he does help out the Turtles later against Shredder near the end of the game. I really like the new story bits they included for this game. I mean, sure, the story in general is pretty much just Season 2, but the new stuff they added is really cool. I really like Slasher as a character. I wish we saw him in other TMNT media. It would be really cool to see a new iteration of him, even if that's probably unlikely to happen. Like the first game, the cutscenes use clips from the series while also using original animation made for this game. Again, it must have been really cool to see this original animation at the time, even if you can definitely tell which is from the show and which was made for this game. In fact, it's actually even more noticeable here because there are several times where the game switches between the show clips and the original animation made for this game, and it's pretty obvious. Oh yeah, I should have probably mentioned this before, but because of how many clips are used for this game, the GameCube version is one of those games that is actually played on 2 separate discs. So if you're thinking of getting the GameCube version specifically, make sure you got both discs. So story-wise, it's pretty good. But for everything else in this game, man, Battle Nexus is one of the most conflicted games I've played for this channel so far. There's so much I really like about it, yet there's equally so much I really dislike. Let's start with the positives first. For one, I think the game looks pretty nice. I'd say it looks better than the first game. The colors are more vibrant and the animations for the characters are pretty good. The environments are a big step up from the first game too, and the soundtrack is pretty awesome. Battle Nexus' soundtrack really slaps hard. Just a lot of energetic tracks that pump you up for whatever level or boss you gotta face. It's great stuff. If you don't end up playing this game, at the very least, listen to the soundtrack. So in the first game, it was split between 4 campaigns for each of the 4 turtles. Although despite this, all of their playthroughs were pretty much identical with the exceptions to the bosses they fight. Battle Nexus instead is one big adventure. You can play as any of the 4 turtles, plus a few unlockable characters including Casey and Splinter from the first game, as well as 2 new characters, Karai and Slasher. You travel through each level via this giant map. It's pretty linear for the most part, although there are a few times you could decide which level you want to do first, but it's pretty rare when that happens. The actual gameplay is once again another 3D beat 'em up. Your goal is to get to the end of the stage, although there are a couple times where the goal might change, but again, that's very rare. But man, you want to talk about a huge downgrade? Take a look at this combat. Now, I will still defend the first game's combat. I think it felt really good, fluid, and just worked pretty well. Battle Nexus, on the other hand, feels incredibly stiff and awkward. Movement doesn't feel fluid in the slightest compared to the first game, and the combat feels so sluggish. It feels like my attacks are delayed enough where it just screws up the entire flow of the fight. Plus, since some of these enemies are a bit tougher than the first game selection, I dreaded fighting most of these enemies, especially the underground monsters. These were the absolute worst. I will say though, and maybe it's just me, but when playing as the unlockable characters like Slasher and Karai, and not the turtles, the combat oddly feels a little bit better. I mean, the combat still does not feel anywhere as good as the first game, but playing as the unlockable characters made the combat a little bit more comfortable, and not as much of a slog. But again, the combat is still such a huge downgrade from the first game. The turtles, and I guess by extension the unlockable characters, do have some unique abilities to them, like Leonardo being able to slice up bars and Donnie activating some machinery. It doesn't come up too often when you need to use these abilities, but I guess that's neat to kind of differentiate them. The game also includes a lot more platforming this time, but it's absolutely terrible. The controls do not feel good enough for platforming like this, and the camera, which is honestly pretty wonky throughout the game, during the platforming sections, it's such a mess. The underground levels with these light up buttons were not fun to do, and during one of the last stages in the game was an absolute nightmare getting past. There's a reason the first game did not have much platforming. It can lead to stuff like this. One thing I will give Battle Nexus some credit is that you can play this up to 4 players. I unfortunately couldn't play this with multiplayer, but that's nice to have at least. One thing I don't understand though is why everyone shares the same health bar. I don't know why they couldn't just have their own health bar. To be honest, while I'm glad there is 4-player multiplayer this time, I'm also kind of thankful I didn't get to play this with multiplayer because I can't imagine how bad it would be to platform through some of these levels with 3 other people having the same health bar. That does not sound fun. But you want to know the funniest thing about all this? As much as I didn't like the combat and the actual platforming you had to do, most of the stages weren't that bad. I really dig the aesthetics a lot for some of these stages. It's a lot more variety in locations compared to the first game. You of course start in New York, but then you go to a couple different planets, a virtual feudal Japan, and even a future version of New York. Not all the stages were winners. Like I mentioned, the underground and one of the Shredder Freighter stages had some awful platforming. I also wasn't a big fan of the Pet Black Alley stage. Great music, but carrying the Fugitoid to the end wasn't very fun. Any of the stages with the chase sequences were really annoying, especially the one in the Pet Black sewers. Gosh, this one was really bad. But otherwise, despite me not really liking the combat or platforming, I did like traveling through some of these locations. I really like traveling through most of the different planet stages. Virtual Feudal Japan as a whole was pretty solid, and most of the New York stages were pretty good. I also like the little vehicle stages you have from time to time. They weren't amazing, but they were pretty decent. The bosses, despite me not liking the combat, weren't that bad either. None of them were really annoying to deal with, and I enjoyed the music during these fights. I'd say they're on par with the first game's fights. If the combat was better, I would have liked these a lot more, but otherwise, they weren't awful. Also, shoutouts to the feudal Shredder fight where you can just knock him off the stage. That was pretty funny. Throughout the stages, you can collect these crystals that can improve your character, which is nice at least, and there's a ranking system too. I didn't bother with this, but if you're into how, let's say, the 3D Sonic games rank you, then you'll probably find these pretty fun. There's also the Battle Nexus mode. Yeah, the titular title of the game is just a separate mode. It's basically a bunch of boss rushes, with a couple of unique fights that are based off the Big Brawl 4-parter from Season 2. I didn't spend much time here, but hey, if you like boss rushes, you'll like this. Lastly, throughout the stages, you'll find these artifacts you can take back to April's shop and view them. One of these artifacts in particular is pretty special, as one of them is the original 1989 arcade game that you can unlock and fully play. Now, this might be a bit of a hot take, but I'm just gonna be straight up with you all. I don't really like the original TMNT arcade game.
What the shell?
I don't think it's a bad game by any means, but I just never got into this one. I like stuff like Turtles in Time, the GBA version of the first 2003 game, and especially Shredder's Revenge in terms of the 2D beat-em-up Turtles games I've played. But the original arcade game, I just never really dig too much. I don't know, maybe it's because it was way before my time, or maybe it's my preference for 3D beat-em-ups instead of 2D beat-em-ups, but I just never was into this one, and in case you're wondering, no, I don't like the NES port either. As for the version on Battle Nexus, well, it runs and plays okay enough. It's pretty much just the original arcade game with edited voices and the entire soundtrack being replaced by only 2 songs. Yeah, there's only 1 song that plays in the stages and 1 song for the bosses, so I hope you like these 2 songs because that's all you're gonna be hearing. I should also mention that if you want to play as a specific turtle, it's determined via which one of the 4 controller ports you plug into. So if you're playing the PS2 version, you'll need a multi-tap to pick from all 4 turtles. Otherwise, the port is okay enough, though you're probably better off playing the Cowabunga collection if you really want to play the original arcade game. I will say though, it's not just I'm not a fan of the original arcade game, it must have been pretty cool at the time to have it unlockable like this. Believe it or not, this was the main reason a lot of people bought this game in the first place. There was no way to play the original arcade game aside from the ports, so having it here was pretty neat all things considered. So here's the thing, I wouldn't say Battle Nexus as a game is terrible per se, but it's incredibly flawed. There's a lot of stuff I really like about it, but equally a lot that just holds it back for me. I really like the added story here, the music is awesome, the new playable characters are cool, and I like traveling through these stages. But the controls are clunky, the combat doesn't feel good, the platforming is awful, and overall, I'm just not a fan of how it plays. It's a game I'm pretty split on, but I can tell you right now that I definitely think the first game is way better. But before we get into the full conclusion, let's take a look at the Game Boy Advance game. I never really knew much about this one. I didn't know what people felt about it, I just knew it kind of existed. I managed to find a copy of it via that double pack with the first game, and now I'm gonna see what it's all about. So the story is sort of like the console version, but also isn't. It still adapts elements from Season 2, but the events are played out pretty differently. For one, instead of the turtles getting transported accidentally to another planet via the Utroms, it's Shredder and Stockman that send him to another world. Splinter isn't even taken by the Utroms like in Season 2 or the console version. He just finds them and gets their help to bring the turtles home. Also, like, despite the game being called TMNT 2 Battle Nexus, you don't even go to the Battle Nexus itself in this version of the game. It's very weird, and what's also strange is that the game kind of expects you to know the plot of Season 2 already. Because there are several times where there is no context given on why you're in a level or fighting a specific boss. Like here, suddenly you're in this arena with this guy you have to fight, but the game gives no context on this. You're just thrown into it. And here, you're suddenly fighting the ultimate ninja, even though there is no cutscene explaining who this is if you've never watched Season 2. Also, for some reason, he's in the virtual feudal Japan, even though he was never in this location in Season 2, but whatever. Like, obviously, I know the context since I've watched Season 2, but why not just have more of these text cutscenes to explain what is going on for the people who haven't seen Season 2? The console game did this well, and even the first GBA game at least gave you the context of what was going on. The story just feels so nothing. I forget there is even a story in this game because there's barely any cutscenes at all. But, you know, if it just wants to focus on the gameplay, I guess that's fine. So, what's the game like? Well, it's pretty different compared to the first GBA game. Instead of it being a straight beat 'em up, it's more of a stealth game. You start every level without your weapons, and you're basically trying to sneak around enemies to not only find your weapons, but also get into the end and collecting these crystals, which you'll find throughout the stages, though you should be able to find most of these okay. I will say the game looks really good for the Game Boy Advance, and the music once again is great stuff. Some of it is from the console version, but there's some original tracks that are really good too. My favorite is definitely the song that plays during the second shoot 'em up stage. It's so good. Unfortunately, the game doesn't feel as good to play as the first game in terms of the combat. Like, moving around is fine, but I'm not really a fan of how the fighting works. It just feels really awkward. But the thing is that makes me overlook that, at least for the first couple worlds, is the game isn't really pushing you to fight these enemies. Sure, there are a couple times you'll have to fight, and of course there's the bosses, but it's more of a risk and reward type deal like 80% of the time. You're more encouraged to sneak past them, and I know that sounds really odd for a TMNT game, but I find this concept really interesting. The idea of having to sneak around levels, finding your weapons, and only really using them when it's absolutely necessary is a really cool idea. The first 3 worlds I think did this pretty well. We even had some vehicle sections which I liked. They were really hard, in fact, because of how you're more encouraged to avoid the enemies this time instead of just fighting them. The game is considerably more challenging than the first GBA game, but it was a fair challenge, and it was pretty satisfying getting through these stages. Like, for instance, I was stuck on this boss during the end of this shoot 'em up stage for a bit, but after learning its attacks better and finally beating it, that felt really good. But here's the thing. All this only applies to the first 3 worlds, because everything just crashes into a wall once you start the 4th world, Feudal Japan. I can't tell you enough how much I hated playing through this world. Now the game expects you to master the combat, which it didn't really feel great to use, but it made sense since the game before was more encouraging to be more of a stealth game than to just fight the enemy head on. Here, that idea is thrown completely out the window with these ninjas that have so much health, are incredibly quick, and will detect you no matter what. You can't sneak past any of them. Sure, you could hide in the rotating door, but even after you leave, they come back no matter what, and that got really annoying. Plus, the level design was just awful. These spikes were most of the time you won't see coming, and they just drain like a third of your health bar. There aren't many health packs to pick up either, and by the way, I didn't mention this before, but this game has no checkpoints, so if you die towards the end of a stage, you're going back to the beginning. And with this world, it was very tedious. I'm gonna be upfront with you all, I could not finish this game. This world was so awful that it just turned me off from finishing this entire game, which is a huge shame because I did like the ideas a lot for the first 3 worlds. I wasn't loving it, but I definitely was liking what it had, but the 4th world just completely destroyed all of that. I really wanted to finish this one, but I simply can't do that. The 4th world was just that bad, and I can't imagine the 5th world being that much better either. Aside from that, well, there are some multiplayer modes you can play. Obviously, I couldn't get other people to play this, so I didn't really spend much time here, but these modes were fine, I guess. They must have been pretty fun to play with other people. But yeah, I'm pretty disappointed with this game. So, the full conclusion of both games. Could I recommend the console version? I'd say if you're a really big fan of the 2003 TMNT series, then you'll find some stuff to enjoy about it. There's some really neat stuff in this game, and I think any fan of the series would really appreciate. In that way, yeah, maybe check it out. Otherwise, I can't really recommend this one to everyone. it's a pretty flawed game. I wouldn't say it's terrible, but compared to the first game, it's a big step down. As for the GBA version, I don't think I can fully recommend this one either. Lots of great ideas with this one, but it all falls apart once you get to that fourth world. Funny thing, like the first GBA game, you have to play on normal mode to play through the whole game, as when you play it on easy, you'll only be able to play through the first 3 worlds, so I guess if you really want to try this one, then just play easy mode and you won't even need to touch the fourth world. Otherwise, you can definitely pass on this one. So, that was something. Definitely interesting games for sure, but man, they could have been so much better. Well, the next time I look at TMNT games, it'll be both versions of TMNT 3 Mutant Nightmare. I'll try not to make the wait as long, though, between TMNT videos. Anyways, if you liked this video, give it a like, and if you're new here to the channel, hit that subscribe button. Plus, let me know in the comments if you've played either version of Battle Nexus and what do you think of them. I'm curious on what you all think of this game nowadays. Well, I hope you all have an amazing day and take care. Bye!